So my name's Richard Scott, and Faber have very kindly invited me to come and talk about some of my favourite queer books, to give you something to read during London Pride. So without further ado, I'm going to go to my pile here. Can you see my pile? I'm just going to move my pile okay, I've got a pile here, so this is my pile. So I'm going to go to Walt Whitman, who is basically like the granddaddy of gay poetry as far as I'm concerned. I'm massively obsessed with Walt Whitman. I love Walt Whitman. And Leaves of Grass was essentially his only book, but he published it 8 times during his lifetime. And it's the second publication that I want to talk about that because it included Song of Myself in its full version, which we know today. Towards the end of his life, he revised it and he maybe cleaned it up and tidied it up a little bit. So if you're looking to read Leaves of Grass, and I hope you will after watching this, go to the 1856, which is the second version, which is sort of unilaterally considered the best. It's really hard to describe Song of Myself. If you've read it, you'll know what I mean. It's a wide-rangy poem of 52 sections, which talks about his love for humanity, the importance of democracy, the landscape, the effects of war on the American people, and crucially also talks about sexual love of all different varieties. And it's really important to think that in 1855, 1856, when Walt Whitman was writing this and self-publishing it, homosexuality was punishable by castration or indeed by imprisonment of 20 years in America. So he was really fighting an uphill battle at the time. And despite getting fired from his job as a government clerk, and despite a looming obscenity trial that tried to confiscate some copies of Leaves of Grass, Song of Myself went on to be successful and slowly over the years has become unilaterally loved for the classic that it is. There's so many bits that I could talk about from it, and I realise now I'm supposed to be doing 5 books in 5 minutes. I've probably spent 5 minutes just on Song of Myself, but I think in terms of how progressive it was, there's an amazing section. Section 11 is when Walt Whitman, the poem's constantly in the first person. He's always using the I voice to talk to the reader and talk about his experiences. In section 11, he switches gender and he becomes a woman who's watching 28 young men bathing in the shore, and he becomes the 29th person in that scene, and he's sort of watching and marvelling at their beauty and wanting to splash them, wanting to get involved. And it might sound, maybe like a silly kind of erotic pastiche, but, of course, over 150 years ago, you could be castrated for writing things like that. So hats off to Walt Whitman. And yeah, it's great. Okay, so on to the next book, which is this by Adrian Rich. You can see how well loved this book has been by me. I've read it again and again. So basically, in 1977, Adrian Rich published The Dream of a Common Language, and included in that is 21 love poems, which really kind of broke the mold for LGBTQ literature in the 70s. It's a really romantic section of 21 poems that I've read again and again, as you can see. And of course it's not 21 poems. The big trick is that it is 22 poems and that there's a hidden, unnumbered, floating poem in it, which is extraordinary. And she did that because, of course, the floating poem is really sexual. Whatever happens with us, your body will haunt mine, tender, delicate, your love-making, like the half-curled frond of the fiddlehead fern in the forests, just washed by sun. I could just keep going and read the whole thing, it's so good. But this was really progressive in the 70s, especially thinking, poetry was, of course, incredibly male-dominated. Not only was lesbian sex ignored by society, it was also ignored by poetry and literature at the same time. So writing an entire sequence thinking about sex between women and love, and contrasting that against the violence and the social injustices of Manhattan at the time was always going to be a real really incredible and progressive thing to do. So The Dream of a Common Language, 21 Love Poems by Adrian Rich. I'm going to turn back to my pile now. So we're in the middle of London Pride, and I'm going to show you this book, Gay Shame. I really love the title and the cover. We are in the middle of London Pride, and maybe I think you should read Gay Shame if Pride sometimes makes you feel a little bit left out, or potentially if you're a bit ambivalent by some of the messages of Pride. Now, I think Pride is a totally amazing event that has saved countless lives worldwide and helped organise all sorts of support, social, governmental, legal support for LGBTQ people around the world. And there are some places which have trouble holding Pride, or indeed it's still banned. So Pride still has, such amazing work to do. But Gay Shame celebrates a 2003 queer theory conference, which basically looks to it wants to say that gay pride might not be possible if you can't think about the opposite, which is gay shame. And as a people, we've come from a place of illegality, of marginalization. We've been told for hundreds of years that we're, psychologically, wrong, that homosexuality is a disease. And Gay Shame seeks to kind of positivize that trauma through a series of essays by people like Eve Sedgwick, Leo Bassani is also in here. Who else? So Eve Sedgwick is in here. She's really one of the writers who began Gay Shame. She thinks about gay shame in terms of performativity and how we're all performing roles of shame all the time. How gay people often feel ashamed for things that heterosexual people don't feel ashamed for. Douglas Crimp is in here. He's talking about Andy Warhol and his films he made with Mario Monteith. Leo Bassani is also here. He's got an excellent essay where he talks about how he's kind of unimpressed by the whole shame thing and how the conference hasn't really worked for him. But this book, I can't recommend it enough. Reading it really kind of revolutionized my life, and it made me feel incredibly thankful for having gay pride, but also that I shouldn't ignore possibly the darker parts of my sexuality, which had made me previously feel uncomfortable or shameful, and actually that it's okay to kind of realize that you came from a place of negativity, but by expressing that you can move to a place of positivity. So that's Gay Shame, and that's edited by David Halperin and Valerie Traub. So my fourth book is Tom Gunn's The Man with Night Sweats. I actually think that this was one of the first poetry collections I read all the way through when I was starting to read poetry properly years and years ago. It's a totally extraordinary collection. It was published in 1992 when America was in the middle of the AIDS crisis. Indeed, the world was. Around that time, 50,000 gay men were dying a year from AIDS or AIDS-related illnesses in America alone. And Tom Gunn, he's tried to sort of pay homage to that lost generation by writing in a non-self-indulgent and intimate and domestic way about his friends, his lovers or ex-lovers, and other poets. Indeed, he sometimes uses lines in the poems, or indeed as epigraphs of poets who we lost to AIDS, and it feels incredibly moving that he's done that. And the whole collection is staggeringly moving and emotional, but it's always tempered with his awareness of form. August Kleinzahler called Tom Gunn an Elizabethan poet, and I think that's absolutely right. He's always writing through a formal lens. Anything emotional, anything slightly confessional is always pressed through that sort of that formal gauge, if you will, to make sure it stands the test of extraordinary poetry. And we're left with such amazing poetry that pays homage to a generation that was lost, and it contains so much rage as well, because of course politicians at the time in America refused to take note of the AIDS crisis, or they didn't in time, and a lack of education, lack of money put into drug funding meant that thousands and thousands of gay men died, unnecessary deaths, and that sense of anger and that sense of it being a genocide hangs over this book. But it's a great read, and I think it's really important to read it during a time of celebration, because it shows what gay people have been through and what we are indeed still going through, but what how we've met challenges and how they've filtered into our literature and become part of us. So Tom Gunn, The Man with Night Sweats. And my last book is Fire to Fire, and this is new and selected poems by Mark Doty. What to say about Mark Doty, other than I kind of have a total man crush on him. Yeah, he's amazing. In my head, he feels kind of like the successor to Whitman, maybe, in the way that he embraces humanity and the way that he has this generous and kind nature about the things that we've done, our foibles. He is an absolutely incredible writer, and this book really shows his range. So we begin with things from Turtle Swan, which is his first collection, 1987, where he's got Charlie Howard's Descent, where he deals with a homophobic murder. We move on to Bethlehem in Broad Daylight, and then to My Alexandria, which is probably his most famous collection, which dealt with the AIDS crisis in America. His rage at that, his fear and his anger, and then right the way through to later collections that detail the life of gay men in various cities in America, and some of his other concerns, which are the natural kingdom, our place in the natural kingdom, impending sense of death and what might happen after we die, and sort of making that circle back to Whitman, because of course Whitman wrote so eloquently about death. What is grass? He's always asking. It was the upturned beards of soldiers, of young men, and Mark Doty seems to be posing a lot of similar questions, asking about what might happen to us, what becomes of love, what becomes of language. This, of course, also contains one of my favourite poems, A Green Crab Shell, which is an absolute masterclass in writing poetry. It's a simple observation. The poet finds, or the narrator of the poem finds a green crab shell on the shore, on the seashore. But more than that simple observation, it takes into account Rilke's great poem, Archaic Torso of Apollo, and it also talks about the AIDS crisis and the vulnerability of queer bodies. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of this. And happy Pride. A Green Crab Shell by Mark Doty. Not exactly green, closer to bronze, preserved in kind brine, something retrieved from a Greco-Roman wreck, patinated and oddly muscular. We cannot know what his fantastic legs were like, though evidence suggests 8 complexly folded, scuttling works of armament, crowned by the four-claws gesture of menace and power. A gull's gobbled the centre, leaving this chamber size of a demitasse, open to reveal a shocking Giotto blue. Though it smells of seaweed and ruin, this little travelling case comes with such lavish lining. Imagine breathing surrounded by the brilliant rinse of summer's firmament. What colour is the underside of skin? Not so bad to die, if we could be opened into this, if the smallest chambers of ourselves similarly revealed some sky